Just outline for us the request you're making to government for personal protective equipment.
Well, good day, and thank you for the opportunity. Maybe one must just indicate that while we welcome the announcement made by the state president on Sunday night, there are certain parts which we have agreed that we will rather channel into a process that is currently ongoing between us and the Department of Transport in as far as taxi operations at this moment under COVID are concerned, and that would relate to the issue of which you have raised in the form of a question as the PPEs and so on.
So precisely what are you requesting for?
Look, I'm not too sure if I understand you correctly to say that we have requested PPEs. But what I can assure you is that in the meeting that we had yesterday as SANTACO leadership is that we are now facilitating an urgent meeting with the Department of Transport. The issue of PPEs is just one issue of the other issues that are currently in discussion, that we are currently in discussions with the Department of Transport. The issue around 70%, the issue around safety measures to ensure that 100% and so on is complied with. So there's a whole host of issues. And the reason why it becomes a bit tricky for us to actually respond to that is that we have an understanding that we have with the Department of Transport that until such time these issues have been fully exhausted, the parties would refrain from expressing themselves in the media. However, we want to indicate to the South African public that we also want to play our part to assist government in ensuring that the issue around compliance, as been directed by the Minister of Commuter, is compliant with.
Mr. Mlelekwa, I think it's a bit disingenuous to say to the public we can't speak to you while we're having conversations, because this is really a topical matter at the moment. Since the President had this address on Sunday, there were many other issues that the public was expecting the President to touch on. But he expressly touched on the issue about new regulations in terms of taxis, and that taxis can now have 100% in terms of the people who, the people you transport to work and so on and so forth. There is a need for some sort of detail into how this came about. How are you engaging the presidency that led to this decision?
Well, what you are saying is quite right, I must say. Difficult as it is for me to actually respond, but what you are saying is quite right. But let me just indicate that SANTACO is engaging with the Department of Transport, and the presidency has made an announcement based on that process. And unfortunately, some of the elements of that of what the presidency made an announcement on are currently ongoing between us and the Department of Transport, and this is what made the situation tricky. But I must indicate that based on what the presidency has announced, there are a number of elements, there are a number of processes that will obviously follow, one of which would be Commuter to direct regulations, and that would be followed by various industries or departments to announce unique regulations to that effect, which is where we come in, because part of 100% or 70% goes along with safety measures that must be put in place. And those safety measures, what I'm trying to say is that we are currently in discussions with the Department of Transport on, for example, the issues of how do you ensure that if people are filled to capacity, if a taxi is filled to capacity, how do we ensure that the driver, the commuters comply with those rules throughout the period of the trip, and what are the punitive measures that are in place. SANTACO also, for its part, is currently in discussions with the provinces, and I think sometime later between today and tomorrow, we will also have our own punitive measures to ensure that these measures, as directed, for example, in the regulations announced by the Minister of Commuter, how do we ensure that in the ranks in the taxis, our drivers also are able to comply with. So it is regrettable that I am not at liberty to disclose everything, and I want to express our sincere apologies. But we would request that the public must trust that at the right time, and that is very soon, such an announcement will be made on what exactly is this, how exactly this is going to unfold.
In the interim, have you started filling to capacity?
Well, yes, that is currently ongoing. But I think in the meeting yesterday that we had as the leadership of SANTACO, the greatest concern was a growing occasional compliance on the side of our drivers, on the side of some commuters. We've been receiving complaints, for instance, that there are drivers who do not put in masks. There are drivers who put masks as and when they see law enforcement. There are some commuters who put masks as and when. So these are issues that have really concerned us, particularly because of now we have moved into this 100%. And these are issues that we want to find ways in which we can be able to manage them.
Not only compliance, I mean, this relaxing of the regulations that you can fill to capacity comes at a time when the infection rates and the death rates are really spiking. Is SANTACO concerned about this?
100%. And this is why, as I mentioned earlier, that it is unfortunate that our wishes to have 100% coincides with the time where really the pandemic is on a very drastic rise, if I must say. And this is why we have taken even our own initiative to say, over and above the rules or the regulations that government has put in place, what is it we are going to do on our part? For instance, we do have what is our road safety campaign called Hlokomela. Part of what we are doing now, we are now trying to reinforce the operations of those patrol vehicles of Hlokomela to ensure that now we are getting into the ranks, we are getting onto the road throughout the country to assist, to ensure compliance within the taxi industry. And this does not exclude possible punitive measures that may be taken against the offending drivers, which are currently in discussions and will be finalized, hopefully by the end of the day, and communicated to the structures of SANTACO countrywide.
Professor Salim Abdul Karim, who is a South African epidemiologist, but also part of the Coronavirus Command Council, mentioned something interesting. He says in the taxi industry's fight to bring back their industry back into full operation, the one thing they're not dealing with is the driver of the taxi. The fact that this is the one person who has to sit there when people come in and out and not always ensuring that the protocols are followed. What conversations is SANTACO having about protecting their taxi drivers in the fight against coronavirus?
In fact, we did have a session with Professor Karim, and he did mention exactly what you are raising, in the sense that their greatest risk or their greatest concern around the risk between the commuter and the driver is the driver. Because if the driver was going to be infected, commuters leave the taxi, but the new set of commuters who come into his or her taxi are the victims of a possible infection. And this can multiply very badly in a day. So, and this is why I had indicated that part of what we are doing is to want to put in place measures that would include punitive measures against the very drivers, because unless drivers own the process, we will not beat the fight against coronavirus within the taxi industry. And this is why we want to educate them, we want to alert them on the measures that we are going to take, and want to also warn them against the possible punitive measures that would be put in place should they be found not to be compliant.
So, as you said, you're in these conversations at the moment, and at the same time, parallelly, taxis are filling to capacity. What measures are you putting in place to ensure that taxi commuters are safe?
Well, you've got your standard safety measures as announced by both the Minister of Commuter and would subsequently be announced further by the Minister of Transport. But the biggest challenge that we have is this type of relationship between the driver and commuter, where sometimes you have taxis filled to capacity, or even half for that matter. But you still find that in that taxi you've got one commuter who is not masked, and everybody's okay with it. Or you've got a taxi with commuters who are masked, but the driver does not have a mask, and everybody's okay with it. And this is the attitude that we want to change. I will tell you what we did last week. For Thursday and Friday, part of what we did in Tshwane, we did a small survey to observe, without necessarily interrupting the operations of taxis. We observed the general compliance of both commuters and drivers inside taxis, and we have realized that effectively people cannot say they do not have masks. What we have realized is that people are not comfortable with wearing masks for the period that they are in a taxi, and this is the biggest problem. And this is why we are now putting in Hlokomela patrol vehicles, which will then drive around, monitor. And these vehicles, part of what we want to do, want them to be able to stop vehicles and taxis in this regard. Taxis which are found where a driver is not wearing a mask, or there is a commuter who's not wearing a mask and the driver has not done anything about it, to be able to deal with the matter there and there without necessarily having to wait for the driver to reach a rank or to reach a particular destination, because at the time where there is no mask for any one individual person, the virus can find opportunity to transmit.
There's a viewer on Twitter, Da Vinci, says, please ask SANTACO spokesperson why do they feel that government must supply PPE for their business while other businesses must foot their own PPE cost. Now, this comment leads me to my next question, where I want to ask you. The taxi industry is not the only affected industry. Other sectors such as the liquor industry, the production thereof and the distribution are very aggrieved that they're not able to operate. The cigarette industry is aggrieved that they're not able to operate. The restaurants took the government to court. How does SANTACO or the taxi industry respond to the assertion that the taxi industry is holding the government at ransom? There's also opinion that this might be related to local elections coming up next year. How does SANTACO respond to this?
Well, firstly, we are not holding the government to ransom. But secondly, what must be understood quite clearly, and this is both the public and government, is that we will not sit idle and see the business perish. And this is what led to the standoff between us and the Minister of Transport. We were just simply trying to defend a business which was on the verge of collapse. Now, when the lockdown started, and I'm referring to the first phase or the first 21 days of lockdown, taxi industry was expected to load 50%. And we did that unconditionally in support of government's efforts to contain the virus. But you must remember that at 50%, the taxi industry is not even breaking even. And this is why when you look at the amount of money that has been lost from day one of lockdown to date, you'd realize that at a minimum of about 25 million rands per day that was lost by the taxi industry. The loss is quite worrisome. And unless, and this is what we said, unless such time that government makes significant intervention in this process, you have a situation where about 40 to 45% of taxis will be lost to repossessions of government. And this is why I said earlier, it puts me in an awkward position for me to comment, because some of these processes already are finding attention of the minister, for example, around the banks, for example, around the relief, and so on and so on. So the reason why we requested the PPEs and the reason why we feel that government really needs to intervene is not precisely because we wanted special attention or we made a demand or because we want to hold the government at ransom. That is precisely because already we have lost so many millions that we will not be able to recover, that government relief would not be able to close. But what we want is just an effort on the side of government to assist us pull through the heavy times that we are currently experiencing, and PPEs is one of them. But I must also indicate that those PPEs are not coming at the level which people may have a perception of, that we are 100% funded on these PPEs. We've got our structures that have been funding themselves to ensure that the commuters continue to be sanitized and they are running dry as we speak. And this is why we are putting pressure on the department through the process currently ongoing, that there's a need for now government to distribute these PPEs to the industry, because really there is absolutely no money on our side.
You was talking about the government relief. Just bring us up to speed. The fact that you can now fill to capacity, does that negate the 1 billion relief fund that was announced by the Minister of Transport, or is that still going ahead?
That is still going ahead. We have agreed between ourselves and the department that this back and forth, government cannot do that, we cannot accept that, it's not helping. Let us rather sit down and really begin to look into this issue of the relief fund. Let us find innovative ways on how best we can deal with it. And that process is part of what is happening between us and the department at the moment. So the issue of the relief is still on the table. 100% is not really negating that item.
Have you come to some sort of agreement in terms of how the fund is going to be dispensed?
No, not at all. We are still discussing what the minister would refer to as the modalities around how that fund is going to be distributed. But also, we are discussing what elements could be, connected to the fund in a form of extra resources and so on. Because remember, the relief is not necessarily about getting money from government. The relief is about saving or keeping the business afloat for the next coming 6 months, particularly away from possible or looming repossessions from the banks more than any other thing.
Virtually all industries are talking about the new normal and how to proceed in terms of business going forward post-COVID-19. What kind of discussions are taking place within the taxi industry in terms of how to reinvent how the industry works?
Two things, and I'm glad you are raising that question. Two things. The first is that we want to deal with the issue of formalization and to the point that we are clear between ourselves and government on what is formalization and it must kick in. The second issue is that to link to that formalization, we also want to rope in SARS, because we are quite concerned about these perceptions enjoying public attention that we are non-compliant with SARS and so on. And And because you see, of the 200,000 operating licenses that are there, the government would not have issued them if SARS had not certified those applicants as compliant. So every operating license in the country that has been issued to a taxi operator, it has undergone a SARS process. So we also want SARS to be brought in terms of this formalization process, so that we are clear really in terms of this compliance and what are the challenges. Because you see, if for example I'm SARS compliant at the time of the application, and for some point or the other I continue to default, that does not say I don't pay tax. It simply says I'm in the net, but I'm not playing my part as I should. Then the second issue after formalization is that it should be the issue of empowerment of the industry to make it self-sustainable, to make it to put it in its rightful position, which is play its part in the mainstream economy. And this, in the main, would speak to the subsidization of the industry. It is not fair. It is constitutionally incorrect for government to continue to believe that it's right to subsidize modes that offer services to a very less percentage of the commuting public at the exclusion of the majority of our people. So these are the issues that we are currently focusing on beyond COVID-19.
Such a lot to speak about, yet not enough time. Let's just finalize with the empowerment of commuters. President Cyril Ramaphosa has spoken about this being in your hands, addressing the South African public. What can commuters do to ensure their safety when they get into taxis?
Well, and we agree with the president, because you see, it is pointless for us to take measures against drivers as and when we see them. But for the time that we don't see them, commuters continue to be quiet about that. Firstly, I want to start by thanking all those commuters who have continued to engage with us, call us, WhatsApp us, and SMS 24/7 complaining. We've received complaints in Tshwane, we've received complaints in Sanene, and those who have been able to deal with. But we continue to urge commuters to really assist us by talking to us through our number there, where they can be able to WhatsApp us, they can be able to SMS us, or they can even be able to call us and express themselves on non-compliance that they find in taxis. They don't even have to speak to the driver about non-compliance if they fear that the driver may intimidate them or whatever. But they've got a number that they can rely on, because without a partnership with commuters, all these efforts that we are taking as the leadership of SANTACO are very futile.
Thabiso Mlelekwa, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
You're watching The Agenda. Let's take a break.